The basement of the Philadelphia Historical Society smelled of old paper, mildew, and the accumulated dust of nearly 2 centuries. Dr. Sarah Chen had grown accustomed to the scent during her 3 months cataloguing the Society's extensive collection of 19th century documents. The fellowship had seemed like a perfect opportunity when she'd applied the previous spring. A chance to spend a year immersed in primary sources while working on her book about antebellum Philadelphia's merchant class. But the reality had proven to be less glamorous than she'd imagined during her interview with the fellowship committee. She spent long hours in inadequate lighting, struggling with water-damaged documents whose ink had faded to near invisibility, engaged in a constant fight against the deterioration that threatened to erase history itself with each passing year. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early October, the kind of grey autumn day that makes Philadelphia feel particularly old and haunted, when Sarah found the portrait. She had been working through a collection of Civil War correspondence, letters written by Philadelphia soldiers to families back home during the darkest days of the conflict. The box was labeled simply 1861, 1863 in faded pencil, and most of its contents had suffered severe water damage from a pipe burst sometime in the 1970s, decades before anyone had thought to properly climate control the archives. Sarah was carefully separating letters that might be salvageable from those too damaged to preserve, when her fingers brushed against something unexpected beneath the pile of ruined papers. It was wrapped in oilcloth, stiff with age, but remarkably intact, as if whoever had hidden it there had known it would need protection from the ravages of time. She pulled the package out carefully, aware that anything this old deserved the gentlest handling. The oilcloth was dark brown, almost black, tied with string that crumbled at her touch like ash. As she unwrapped it layer by layer, her heart rate increased with the anticipation that archivists live for, the possibility of discovering something that had been hidden or forgotten, something that might change our understanding of the past in ways both small and profound. When she finally revealed what lay inside, 8 pairs of eyes stared back at her from the daguerreotype, and something in those gazes made her hands shake in a way that had nothing to do with the chill of the basement air. The image showed 8 boys ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 18, all dressed in the severe black clothing typical of mid-19th century photography. They stood in rigid formation, tallest to shortest, their expressions frozen in that peculiar intensity required by the long exposure times of early photographic technology. A daguerreotype from this period would have required the subjects to remain absolutely motionless for 15 to 20 seconds, and the slightest movement would have resulted in a blurred image. These boys had clearly mastered the art of stillness, but it wasn't the formal poses that disturbed Sarah as she held the portrait under the flickering fluorescent light of the archive room. It was something in their eyes, a hollowness that seemed to reach across the decades like cold fingers brushing against her skin. There was also the way their faces, though clearly those of brothers sharing similar features, all held an identical expression of profound terror masked by forced composure. She had looked at hundreds of 19th century portraits during her research, had grown familiar with the stern expressions that were common in an era when photography was still a formal, serious affair. But this was different. This was fear. Sarah photographed the portrait with her phone, her hand still trembling slightly, and sent it to her colleague, Dr. Marcus Webb, a specialist in early American photography at Penn State University. They had met at a conference 3 years earlier and had collaborated on several projects since then. Marcus had an encyclopedic knowledge of daguerreotypes and the photographers who created them, and Sarah trusted his eye for details that others might miss. Within 20 minutes, her phone rang. Marcus's voice was tight with an emotion she couldn't quite identify when she answered. "Sarah, where did you find this?" he asked without preamble. "In the Society's archives," she replied, setting down the conservation gloves she'd been wearing. It was wrapped in oilcloth, hidden under some Civil War letters. Why? Do you recognize it? No, I've never seen it before, and I've spent 15 years studying daguerreotypes from the 1840s and 1850s, Marcus said. She could hear him typing in the background, probably already pulling up reference materials. But Sarah, there's something about this image. The technical quality is exceptional, the work of a master photographer. The lighting, the composition, it's all first-rate. But the subjects themselves, those boys, they radiate something that makes me uncomfortable in a way I can't articulate. I felt it too, Sarah admitted, looking back at the portrait which she'd placed carefully on acid-free paper on her work table. It's in their eyes, like they're trying to tell us something across all these years. There's more than that, Marcus continued. Look at the way they're positioned, the geometric precision of their arrangement, the way the light falls on their faces. This wasn't a simple family portrait. Whoever commissioned this knew exactly what they wanted, and the photographer was skilled enough to deliver it perfectly. This would have been expensive, Sarah. Very expensive. They talked for another 20 minutes, with Marcus asking detailed questions about the condition of the daguerreotype, the oilcloth wrapping, where exactly in the archives Sarah had found it. He promised to drive down from State College the next day to examine it in person, and Sarah agreed to not show it to anyone else until he arrived. As she hung up the phone, she felt the weight of the portrait's gaze on her, those 8 pairs of eyes that held secrets she was only beginning to uncover. That evening, Sarah sat in her cramped one-bedroom apartment in South Philadelphia, the kind of place that graduate students and junior researchers could afford in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. The portrait's digital image glowed on her laptop screen, and she had magnified it to study each face in detail. The oldest boy, who stood at the back left of the formation, had a scar above his left eyebrow, a thin white line that stood out against his pale skin. The youngest, positioned at the front right, clutched something in his small fist, though the resolution of even the high-quality photo made it impossible to determine exactly what he was holding. All 8 wore expressions that became more disturbing the longer she looked at them. Sarah began searching through the Historical Society's digitized records, looking for any mention of 8 brothers photographed in 1851. The Society had been digitizing its collections for the past decade, and while the work was far from complete, enough material was available online to provide a starting point for research. She searched for combinations of keywords: Brothers 8, 1851, Portrait, Daguerreotype, Philadelphia. Most searches returned nothing relevant, but as the night deepened and her eyes began to ache from staring at the screen, she finally found something. It was buried in the digitized archives of the Pennsylvania Gazette, Philadelphia's oldest newspaper, founded by Benjamin Franklin himself in 1728. The mention was brief, a single paragraph in the culture section from September 12, 1851. It described a portrait of the Blackwood family, 8 brothers who had been subjects of a daguerreotype created by the renowned photographer James Augustus Harrison. What caught Sarah's attention was the peculiar tone of the article. The writer noted that Harrison had refused to display the portrait in his gallery on Chestnut Street, despite it being, in the journalist's words, a technical masterpiece of the daguerreotype art that demonstrates Mr. Harrison's exceptional skill with light and composition. The article went on to quote Harrison himself, and his words sent a chill down Sarah's spine despite the warmth of her apartment. The photographer had told the journalist that the image disturbed the natural order of things, and that he wished he had never created it. When pressed to explain, Harrison had declined to comment further, saying only that some images captured more truth than the world was ready to see. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Why would a photographer refuse to display what was clearly a masterwork? What had Harrison seen in that portrait that disturbed him so profoundly? She returned to her search, now with a specific focus. The Blackwood family of Philadelphia. What she found painted a picture of wealth and prominence. The Blackwood brothers had been sons of Elias Blackwood, a textile merchant whose fortune came from mills that processed cotton shipped up from southern plantations. Elias had been born in 1800, the son of a Scottish immigrant who had arrived in Philadelphia with nothing and built a modest trading business. Elias had expanded his father's enterprise dramatically, recognizing the profit potential in the growing textile industry that was transforming American manufacturing. By 1850, he owned 3 mills in the Philadelphia area and had business relationships with some of the largest cotton plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. Elias had married twice. His first wife, Margaret, had died in 1838, giving birth to their 4th son. In 1840, he had married Catherine Wells, the daughter of another prominent Philadelphia merchant, and she had borne him 4 more sons between 1841 and 1845. The boys' names were listed in several society pages and business documents that Sarah found: Thomas, William, Robert, and Edward from the first marriage, Henry, Charles, Frederick, and Samuel from the second. The family had lived in a substantial townhouse on Rittenhouse Square, one of Philadelphia's most fashionable addresses. Elias had been a founding member of several cultural institutions, a substantial donor to churches and hospitals, and was mentioned frequently in the newspapers in the context of civic affairs. On paper, the Blackwoods appeared to be an exemplary Philadelphia family, exactly the kind of success story that embodied American prosperity in the decades before the Civil War. But what Sarah couldn't find was any information about what happened to the 8 brothers after 1851. The trail went cold. No marriage records, no death certificates, no mentions in city directories or census records after that year. 8 boys, ranging in age from 6 to 18 in 1851, captured forever in that haunting daguerreotype, seem to have simply vanished from the historical record, as if they had never existed at all. Sarah worked until past 3 in the morning, following every possible lead, searching through digitized newspapers, census records, city directories, church registries, cemetery records. Nothing. 8 boys from a prominent Philadelphia family don't just disappear without leaving some trace, some record of their existence beyond a single year. The absence of information was itself a kind of evidence, a hole in the historical record that suggested something had happened, something significant enough that all traces of these boys had been carefully erased. When she finally went to bed, Sarah's dreams were troubled by images of 8 faces staring at her with hollow eyes, their mouths moving as if trying to speak words she couldn't hear across the barrier of time. Marcus arrived at the Historical Society early the next morning, having left State College before dawn. Sarah met him in the main entrance hall, and they went immediately to the archive room where she had locked the portrait in a climate-controlled storage cabinet overnight. As she carefully removed it and placed it on the examination table, Marcus pulled on a pair of white cotton gloves and leaned in close, not touching the daguerreotype, but studying it with the intense focus she had seen him apply to particularly interesting or problematic images. "My God!" he said softly after several minutes of silence. "Sarah, this is extraordinary. Not just the technical quality, which is remarkable, but what it captures. I've never seen anything quite like it." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew. She had spent hours staring at those 8 faces, had felt the same disturbing quality that Marcus was now experiencing. Marcus straightened up and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. Daguerreotypes are unique among photographic processes in that they're not actually photographs in the modern sense. They're objects, physical artifacts where the image is created by light-sensitive silver particles on a copper plate. What makes them special is their clarity, their ability to capture reality with a precision that later photographic processes couldn't match. When we look at a daguerreotype, we're not seeing a representation of the subject. We're seeing the actual light that reflected off them, preserved in silver. He put his glasses back on and looked at the portrait again. What Harrison captured here is pure, unfiltered reality. These boys couldn't hide what they were feeling, couldn't maintain a facade through the long exposure time. The terror in their eyes, the tension in their postures, the way they're all holding themselves with this rigid control, it's all there in perfect clarity. This image is telling us something about these children, about their lives, and it's not a pleasant story. Sarah nodded. I found some information about them last night. They're the Blackwood brothers, sons of Elias Blackwood, a wealthy textile merchant. But here's the strange part. I can't find any record of what happened to them after 1851. It's like they disappeared. Marcus frowned. That's unusual. Boys from a wealthy family would typically leave extensive records. Education, careers, marriages, deaths. You can usually trace prominent families through multiple generations with relative ease. I know, Sarah said. I've been trying to figure out what it means. The absence of information is itself significant. Let me help you search, Marcus offered. I have access to some databases through Penn State that might have different materials than what you can reach through the Historical Society, and I want to track down more information about James Augustus Harrison, the photographer. His reaction to this portrait, refusing to display it, saying it disturbed him. That's highly unusual for a professional photographer in this period. They made their living by creating and selling images. Refusing to show a technically perfect work suggests something profound happened during or after this sitting. They spent the rest of that day working together, Marcus with his laptop connected to Penn State's library databases, Sarah going through the Historical Society's physical archives for materials that hadn't yet been digitized. As afternoon faded to evening, they began to assemble a more complete picture, and with each new piece of information they uncovered, the story became darker and more disturbing. Marcus found the photographer's journals in the digital archives of the Library Company of Philadelphia, one of the nation's oldest cultural institutions, founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1731. James Augustus Harrison had been a meticulous record keeper, documenting every portrait session in remarkable detail. His journals provided insight into his working methods, his relationships with clients, his thoughts on the art and science of photography. The entry for the Blackwood sitting was dated August 15, 1851, and it was longer than most, written in an increasingly agitated hand that suggested deep emotional disturbance. Harrison described how Elias Blackwood had insisted on being present during the entire session, standing directly behind the camera, watching his sons with what the photographer called an expression of such cold dominion that it made my blood chill. The boys had been required to stand motionless in the precise formation their father demanded, and Harrison noted that, despite the difficulty young children typically had with remaining still, these boys had not moved, had barely seemed to breathe during the nearly 20-second exposure. It was as if they were not living children, but carved statues, Harrison wrote in a passage that made both Sarah and Marcus pause to look again at the portrait. Their fear was palpable in the studio, thick as fog rolling in from the Delaware River. I have photographed many subjects in my career, from the poorest laborers to the wealthiest merchants, from criminals to clergy, but I have never felt such darkness concentrated in one room. The very air seemed heavy with it, and I found myself struggling to breathe normally. Most disturbing was Harrison's final paragraph about the session. When the exposure was complete and I informed Mr. Blackwood that we had achieved success, he leaned down to the youngest boy, Samuel, I believe his name to be, and whispered something directly in his ear. The child went white as death itself, and I saw his small body tremble, though he did not move from his position. As the family prepared to leave my studio, I heard Mr. Blackwood tell his sons that this portrait would ensure they could never escape him, that he would have this image of them forever, that even if they ran to the ends of the earth, he would find them. The oldest boy, Thomas, looked at me with such desperate pleading that I almost spoke up, almost said something to intervene, but cowardice stilled my tongue. I am a photographer, not a hero. I capture images. I do not change the realities those images depict. God forgive me for my silence. Sarah and Marcus sat in the archive room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Marcus said quietly, "This was an abusive household. Harrison witnessed something terrible and didn't intervene." "Because he couldn't," Sarah replied. "In 1851, children were essentially property. Parents, especially wealthy ones, had almost absolute authority over their children. Even if Harrison had reported what he witnessed, nothing would have been done. Elias Blackwood was too prominent, too powerful." "It doesn't make it easier to read," Marcus said, and Sarah saw that his hands were shaking slightly as he scrolled through the digital images of Harrison's journal. Harrison knew he was witnessing abuse, knew those boys were terrified, and he did nothing. "He did something," Sarah said softly, touching the edge of the portrait's protective sleeve. "He preserved this image. He documented what he saw. It took 174 years, but we're finally hearing what those boys were trying to tell us." They continued searching as evening deepened into night. Sarah ordered pizza from a nearby restaurant, and they ate absently while scrolling through databases and archives. It was Marcus who found the next crucial piece of information, buried in the digitized records of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane. In 1853, Elias Blackwood had been committed to the hospital's psychiatric ward. The intake documentation described a man who had suffered a complete mental collapse following what was described only as a domestic tragedy. The attending physician's notes, written in the careful medical language of the era, described Blackwood as suffering from severe delusions and hallucinations. He spent his days screaming about his sons coming for him in the night, about eyes watching him from the shadows of his room, about the portrait that haunted him. He died in the asylum in 1857, never having recovered his sanity, his considerable fortune eventually distributed to distant relatives since he had no direct heirs to claim it. "But what happened to the boys?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to form a theory. "The hospital records mention a domestic tragedy. What was it?" Marcus was already searching through newspaper archives from 1852. It didn't take long to find it. The Philadelphia Inquirer from March 3, 1852, carried a front-page story about a fire at the Blackwood estate on Rittenhouse Square. The article reported that the substantial townhouse had burned to the ground in the early morning hours, the flames so intense that nothing could be saved. Elias Blackwood had been found wandering the streets in his nightclothes, raving about betrayal and vengeance. No bodies had been recovered from the ruins, though the article noted that Mr. Blackwood's 8 sons were missing and presumed to have perished in the blaze. Presumed, but not confirmed. Sarah felt a thrill of possibility. They got out. They escaped. Or their bodies were never found because they were never in the house when it burned. Marcus agreed. "Sarah, I think those boys set the fire themselves. I think they burned down their father's house and ran." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications. 8 boys, the oldest 18 and the youngest only 6, escaping into the night from a house of horrors. Where would they have gone? Who would have helped them? Philadelphia in 1852 was a city of both great wealth and great suffering, a place where progressive reform movements existed alongside brutal poverty and exploitation. It was also a city with active networks of people who helped those trying to escape bondage and tyranny. She began searching through materials related to the Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses and helpers that enabled enslaved people to escape from southern plantations to freedom in the North and in Canada. The Historical Society had extensive collections related to Philadelphia's role in the Underground Railroad, as the city had been a major hub due to its proximity to the Mason-Dixon line and its large population of Quakers and other abolitionists. It took hours of careful searching, but Sarah finally found a reference in the private papers of a Quaker family named Worth. The Worths had been active in the Underground Railroad, maintaining a safe house in the northern part of Philadelphia. Their records, carefully hidden for decades and only donated to the Historical Society in the 1930s after the last family members had died, documented dozens of people they had helped escape between 1840 and 1865. In an entry dated March 5, 1852, just 2 days after the Blackwood House fire, Samuel Worth wrote about sheltering 8 boys who had fled from a house of great evil on Rittenhouse Square. The boys, he noted, bore visible marks of systematic abuse, scars from beatings, burns from what appeared to be deliberate torture. The youngest could barely speak, traumatized into selective mutism. The oldest, whom Worth described as a youth of perhaps 18 years with remarkable composure given his circumstances, had explained that they had set the fire themselves, had waited until their father was in a drugged sleep from the laudanum he took nightly, and had fled into the darkness, knowing they could never return. Worth's entry continued with a description of how the boys had refused to give their names, had insisted they needed to disappear completely to become new people in order to be truly free from their father's reach. The Worth family had contacted other families in the Underground Railroad network, and within a week the boys had been moved north, split up and sent to different locations to make tracking them more difficult. Some went to New York, others to New England, a few were sent west toward the frontier. Worth's final note about them was simple but profound. These children have known a slavery as real as any experienced on the southern plantations, and they deserve their freedom just as surely. May God protect them on their journeys. Sarah and Marcus sat in the archive room as midnight approached, the building silent around them except for the distant hum of the climate control system. They had been working for nearly 16 hours, had uncovered a story that both explained the disturbing quality of the portrait and raised new questions about what had happened to the 8 boys after their escape. "We need to find out what became of them," Sarah said finally. "If they survived, if they built lives for themselves, they deserve to have their whole story told, not just the trauma they experienced." Marcus nodded. "I'll help you. This is too important to walk away from. Those boys were voiceless in their own time, silenced by their father's power and society's indifference. But we can give them a voice now. We can tell their story." Over the following weeks, Sarah and Marcus dedicated themselves to tracing the possible paths of the Blackwood brothers. They expanded their search beyond Philadelphia, looking through census records, city directories, newspaper archives, and genealogical databases across multiple states. It was painstaking work, made more difficult by the fact that the boys had deliberately hidden their identities, had chosen to start new lives under new names, but slowly, carefully, they began to find traces. A young man named Thomas Wright appeared in Sacramento, California in the early 1860s, having traveled west during the gold rush period. Wright, who would have been about the right age to be the oldest Blackwood brother, had not sought gold, but had instead founded a school for orphaned and abandoned children. In an interview published in a Sacramento newspaper in 1870, Wright spoke about his own difficult childhood, though he gave no specific details. "I know what it is to live without freedom, without dignity, without hope. He was quoted as saying, "Every child deserves better. Every child deserves the chance to become who they truly are, not who someone else demands they be." Sarah found a photograph of Thomas Wright from around 1870, included in the newspaper article. When she compared it to the oldest boy in the Blackwood portrait, the resemblance was striking. Same bone structure, same eyes, and yes, there above the left eyebrow, the same thin scar that she had noticed in the daguerreotype 19 years earlier. Marcus discovered a William Anderson who had become a prominent speaker in the abolitionist movement based in Boston in the 1850s and 1860s. Anderson spoke not just about the slavery of African Americans in the South, but about all forms of bondage and tyranny, including what he called the slavery of the home, where those with power can exercise cruelty without accountability. His speeches were reprinted in abolitionist newspapers, and they contained passionate arguments for children's rights, for legal protections against parental abuse, for the fundamental principle that no human being, regardless of age, should be subject to absolute authority without recourse. In Anderson's personal papers, donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, they found a letter he had written in 1868 to Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist leader who had himself escaped from slavery. In the letter, Anderson wrote about his own escape from bondage, using language carefully enough that the specifics remained vague, but clearly indicating that he understood the experience of slavery from personal knowledge. "I was not born in chains in the South," Anderson wrote, "but I wore chains nonetheless, chains forged by a father who believed his will was absolute law. When I and my brothers finally broke free, we understood in our bones what you have taught the nation with your words, that freedom is not given, it must be taken, and that every person has not just the right, but the duty to resist tyranny wherever it exists." Sarah found a Robert Miller who had become a physician in Chicago, specializing in treating children and speaking publicly about the physical and psychological effects of abuse. Miller had published articles in medical journals arguing for doctors to be more vigilant in identifying signs of child abuse and for mandatory reporting of suspected cases. He had also been involved in efforts to establish orphanages and foster care systems as alternatives to keeping children in dangerous homes. Each discovery led to others. A Charles Blackwood, who had not changed his first name but had kept his surname, perhaps as an act of defiance, had become an attorney in Philadelphia, specializing in family law. In 1869, he had submitted a legal brief to the Pennsylvania legislature arguing for expanded rights of children to seek protection from abusive parents. The brief cited his own experience, carefully anonymized but clearly personal, as evidence that children could successfully identify and escape from tyrannical households if given proper legal and social support. The brief had contributed to Pennsylvania passing some of the nation's first child protection laws in 1874, laws that allowed courts to intervene in cases of severe abuse and that established legal mechanisms for removing children from dangerous homes. Charles Blackwood had transformed his suffering into legal change that would protect countless other children in the decades that followed. Frederick, one of the middle brothers, had become a journalist for the Chicago Tribune, writing exposés about child labor, unsafe working conditions in factories where children as young as 6 were employed, and the exploitation of orphans and street children. His articles had helped build public support for the reform movements that would eventually result in child labor laws and compulsory education. Henry had become a Methodist minister in Ohio, preaching about the inherent dignity of every person regardless of age or social status. His sermons, several of which had been published, emphasized the moral duty of the strong to protect the weak, and the sinfulness of exercising power without mercy or accountability. Samuel, the youngest, who had been only 6 when he stood in James Augustus Harrison's studio clutching a small stone, had become a teacher. He had worked in rural schools across the Midwest, teaching children from farming families and frontier settlements, never married, devoted his entire life to education as a tool of liberation and empowerment. Each of the brothers had taken the trauma of their childhood and transformed it into a commitment to protecting others, to expanding freedom, to ensuring that power could not go unchecked. They had done what survivors often do, had turned their wounds into wisdom, their pain into purpose. They had not just escaped, they had thrived, had built lives of meaning and service. Sarah spent months writing an article about her findings. She was careful to document every source, every connection, every piece of evidence that supported her conclusions. She consulted with experts in 19th century history, in photography, in child psychology, in legal history. The article grew into something larger than she had initially envisioned, a comprehensive study that connected the specific story of 8 abused children to the broader themes of power, freedom, and resistance in 19th century America. She titled it The Blackwood Brothers, a portrait of tyranny and resistance in antebellum Philadelphia. The article detailed not just the story of 8 boys who had suffered and escaped, but the broader context of a society that allowed such abuse to flourish, that prioritized property rights and patriarchal authority over the welfare of children, that looked away when the wealthy exercised cruelty behind closed doors. It also explored how the brothers had used their freedom to fight for others, how their personal experiences had motivated them to work toward broader social change. The article was published in the American Historical Review, one of the most prestigious academic journals in the field, and it immediately attracted attention far beyond academic circles. Major newspapers ran features about the discovery. The portrait was featured in exhibitions at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. The story resonated with contemporary audiences who saw connections to ongoing struggles against abuse, against the misuse of power, against systems that protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Marcus developed a scholarly presentation about the photographic aspects of the portrait, giving talks at universities and museums about the unique properties of daguerreotypes and their capacity to capture truth with an almost disturbing clarity. "When we look at those boys," he would tell audiences, "we're not seeing a representation or an interpretation. We're seeing the actual light that reflected off their faces in 1851, preserved in silver. That's why it affects people so deeply. It's not imagination, it's truth, captured in a way that can't be denied or explained away." The portrait itself became famous, viewed millions of times online, after the Historical Society digitized it and made it available on their website. People from around the world wrote to Sarah about their reactions to the image. Many shared their own stories of childhood abuse, of toxic families, of eventually finding the courage to escape. Some were historians or genealogists who had found similar stories in their own research, patterns of family tyranny that had been hidden or ignored by historians more interested in political and economic narratives than in the private suffering that occurred behind closed doors. Sarah continued to research, to follow every possible lead, to piece together the later lives of the brothers as completely as possible. She contacted genealogists specializing in 19th century families, searched through probate records and land deeds, scoured local histories from towns across the country. Slowly, she assembled more complete biographies of the men the Blackwood brothers had become. Thomas Wright, the school founder in Sacramento, had lived until 1903. He had never married, had devoted his entire adult life to his school for orphaned children. When he died, the Sacramento Bee published a long obituary celebrating his contributions to the city and to education. The article mentioned that Wright had come to California during the gold rush but had found his real treasure in teaching, in giving children the opportunities he himself had been denied in his own difficult childhood. He had left his entire estate to the school, which continued operating under his name until the 1960s. William Anderson, the abolitionist speaker, had married a fellow activist in 1865, had 3 children, and had lived until 1891. His widow had donated his papers to the Massachusetts Historical Society, and among them Sarah found letters he had exchanged with his brothers throughout his adult life. The brothers had maintained contact with each other despite being scattered across the country, writing regularly, visiting when possible, forming a support network that had helped them all heal from their shared trauma. In one letter from 1870, William wrote to Thomas about the importance of bearing witness to what they had experienced. "We cannot change what was done to us," he wrote, "but we can ensure that our suffering was not meaningless. Every child we help, every law we change, every person we teach to recognize and resist tyranny, that is our victory over the past." Father thought he owned us completely, thought the portrait would bind us to him forever. But we took our freedom, and we have used it well. Robert Miller, the physician, had published a groundbreaking article in 1875 in the Journal of the American Medical Association about the physical signs of child abuse and the responsibility of doctors to identify and report suspected cases. His work had been revolutionary for its time, one of the first systematic attempts to bring medical expertise to bear on the problem of child maltreatment. He had lived until 1898, respected in his field, his ideas slowly becoming accepted as part of standard medical practice. Charles Blackwood, the attorney who had kept the family name, had become one of Philadelphia's most prominent advocates for legal reform related to children's rights. He had represented dozens of children in court, seeking to remove them from abusive homes or to secure their legal rights in cases of inheritance or custody. In 1880, he had been appointed to a state commission studying child welfare, and his recommendations had shaped Pennsylvania law for decades. He had died in 1905, celebrated in Philadelphia legal circles as a pioneer in family law. Frederick, the journalist, had written hundreds of articles over his career, many of them exposing the exploitation and suffering of children in industrial America. His reporting on child labor in textile mills, on the conditions in orphanages and reform schools, on the treatment of street children in major cities, had helped build public awareness and support for progressive reforms. He had lived until 1912, witnessing the beginnings of the reform movements he had helped inspire. Henry, the minister, had been beloved by his congregations across Ohio, remembered for his compassion and his fierce commitment to justice. His sermons often focused on the gospel stories where Jesus defended children and the vulnerable, arguing that these were not peripheral teachings, but central to Christian faith. He had died in 1907, eulogized as a man who had embodied the teachings he preached. Samuel, the youngest brother, who had been only 6 when the portrait was taken, had lived the longest. He taught in rural schools well into his 70s, finally retiring in 1915 at the age of 70. He had never spoken publicly about his childhood, but his students remembered him as infinitely patient, especially with children who struggled or who came from difficult home situations. He had died in 1920, and his obituary in the local Indiana newspaper, where he had spent his final years, described him simply as a teacher who made a difference in countless lives. Sarah was contacted by descendants of several of the brothers, people who had heard about her research and wanted to share family stories and documents. A great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Wright sent photographs and letters, including one remarkable item: the small, smooth stone that Samuel had clutched in his hand during the 1851 portrait sitting. Thomas had carried it his entire life, and it had been passed down through his family as a treasured heirloom though for generations they hadn't known its full significance. Sarah arranged for the stone to be donated to the Historical Society, where it was displayed alongside the portrait. Museum visitors could see the terrified 6-year-old boy clutching the stone in the daguerreotype, then see the actual stone itself. Preserved across more than 150 years, the stone became one of the exhibition's most powerful elements. It was a physical link between past and present, a tangible reminder that the story was real, that those 8 frightened boys had been actual human beings who had suffered and survived and found ways to transform their experience into something meaningful. The portrait exhibition, which the Historical Society had initially planned to run for 6 months, was extended again and again due to popular demand. It eventually traveled to other cities, to museums in New York, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, each time drawing crowds and generating discussions about child abuse, about power and resistance, about historical memory and how societies choose to remember or forget uncomfortable truths. Sarah organized symposiums and conferences, bringing together historians, child welfare advocates, legal experts, psychologists, and survivors of abuse to discuss the themes raised by the Blackwood story. These gatherings were always emotionally intense, as academic presentations mixed with personal testimonies, as historical analysis intersected with contemporary activism. At one symposium in 2019, a woman who had escaped an abusive family spoke about how the portrait had given her courage. "When I saw those 8 faces," she said, her voice breaking, "I saw myself. I saw what I had been, the terror I had lived with. But then I learned what happened to them, how they escaped, how they built lives of purpose. And I thought if they could do it in 1851 with no resources and no legal protections, then I can do it now. Their story saved my life." Marcus, in his presentations, always emphasized the unique power of the daguerreotype medium. "Photography has always had a complicated relationship with truth," he would say. "We know images can be manipulated, staged, taken out of context. But daguerreotypes are different. They're not negatives that can be altered, not reproductions that can be edited. They're direct captures of reflected light, unique objects that can never be exactly duplicated. When we look at this portrait, we're seeing exactly what James Augustus Harrison saw when he looked into his camera in August 1851. We're seeing the same light, the same faces, the same truth. That's why it's so powerful and why it's so disturbing. We can't distance ourselves from it, can't dismiss it as exaggeration or artistic license. It's simply irreducibly true." Sarah's research expanded beyond the Blackwood family to explore similar cases of child abuse and escape in 19th century America. She found dozens of stories that had been hidden or ignored, patterns of family tyranny that had persisted because society had no mechanisms to intervene, no will to look behind the facade of respectability that wealth and status provided. Each story reinforced her conviction that the Blackwood brothers' experience, while extreme, was not unique, that many children had suffered similarly, and that we needed to remember and learn from these hidden histories. In 2020, Sarah published a book expanding on her original article. 8 Faces, The Blackwood Brothers and the Fight for Children's Freedom became a bestseller. He taught in university courses on history, psychology, and social work. It won several awards and was optioned for a documentary film. The book resonated because it connected a specific historical story to broader themes that remained urgently relevant. The abuse of power, the vulnerability of children, the possibility of resistance and escape, the importance of bearing witness to injustice. The documentary film, released in 2021, used the portrait as its central image, that haunting daguerreotype of 8 terrified boys. The filmmakers interviewed historians, psychologists, child advocates, and descendants of the brothers. They recreated James Augustus Harrison's studio using historical records and period equipment, showing how the daguerreotype would have been made. They traced the possible routes the brothers might have taken in their escape and their subsequent lives. The film ended with contemporary stories of people who had escaped abusive situations, connecting the past to the present in powerful ways. Sarah received thousands of messages after the documentary aired. Many were from people sharing their own stories of abuse and escape, thanking her for bringing attention to these issues. Some were from other historians and researchers who had found similar stories in their own work and wanted to share information. A few were from people who believed they might be descended from one of the Blackwood brothers and wanted to explore the connection. The portrait itself, that disturbing image of 8 boys frozen in terror, became an icon. It appeared in textbooks, in museum exhibitions, in articles about child welfare and family law. Reproductions hung in the offices of child protection agencies, in family courts, in schools for social workers. The Historical Society sold posters and postcards of it, with all proceeds going to organizations working to prevent child abuse. Some people criticized the ubiquity of the image, arguing that displaying it so widely was exploiting the boys' suffering for commercial or ideological purposes. Sarah understood the concern and took it seriously. She wrote an essay addressing the ethics of using traumatic images, arguing that the portrait should be seen not as exploitation, but as testimony. The boys, she argued, had wanted to be seen. Harrison had written that Thomas looked at him with pleading eyes, begging silently for help. They had known the photograph would exist as evidence of what they endured. Hiding it, refusing to look at what it showed, would be complicit in the silence that had allowed their abuse to continue. "We honor them by bearing witness," Sarah wrote. "We honor them by looking at their faces, seeing their fear, and resolving to do better. Every child who is protected because someone recognized the signs of abuse, every law that is passed to strengthen children's rights, every person who finds courage to escape a tyrannical situation after seeing this portrait and learning this story, that is how we honor the Blackwood brothers, not by looking away, but by seeing them clearly and allowing their experience to change us." The Philadelphia Historical Society created educational programs based on the portrait and the brothers' story. School groups visited the exhibition, and trained docents led discussions about child rights, about historical context, about how societies evolve in their understanding of human dignity. Teachers reported that the portrait and the associated materials had profound impacts on their students, sparking conversations about power, authority, respect, and the importance of protecting the vulnerable. Sarah continued researching, knowing she would never find every answer, but compelled to recover as much of the brothers' story as possible. She found a letter from 1888, written by a man named Edward Smith to a friend, describing his childhood in Philadelphia and his eventual escape. The details matched the Blackwood story perfectly, and genealogical research confirmed that Smith was indeed Edward Blackwood, one of the 4 sons from Elias's first marriage. The letter was remarkable for its tone. Despite describing horrific abuse, despite acknowledging the lasting trauma, Smith's focus was on gratitude and pride. "I'm old now," he wrote, "and my brothers are mostly gone, but I carry their memories with love. We did what seemed impossible. We freed ourselves when we were powerless, escaped when we had nowhere to go. Yes, Father marked us, scarred us in ways that will never fully heal, but he did not break us. We became men he never could have imagined, men who used our freedom to fight tyranny in all its forms. That is our victory, our revenge, if you want to call it that. We took what he meant as a symbol of his eternal dominion over us, that portrait, and we transformed its meaning by how we lived our lives. Let others who suffer look at our faces and know escape is possible, freedom is possible. Transformation is possible. Sarah included this letter prominently in the second edition of her book, published in 2023. She also added chapters about the ongoing relevance of the brothers' story, about contemporary efforts to protect children from abuse, about the legal and social frameworks that had evolved over the past century and a half to recognize children as human beings with rights rather than as property of their parents. The portrait had been viewed online by tens of millions of people by 2024, becoming one of the most recognized images in American historical photography. It appeared in social media posts, in articles about various social justice issues, in discussions about power and resistance. People around the world had connected with those 8 faces, had seen in them reflections of their own struggles against various forms of tyranny and oppression. A group of child welfare organizations created an award named in honor of the Blackwood brothers, given annually to individuals or organizations that had made significant contributions to protecting children from abuse and exploitation. The award ceremony, held in Philadelphia each year, featured a reading of the brothers' names and a moment of silence to remember all the children throughout history who had suffered in silence, whose stories remained untold. Sarah was invited to speak at universities, conferences, and public events across the country and internationally. She always brought the story back to fundamental questions about how societies treat their most vulnerable members, about the responsibility of those with power toward those without it, about the necessity of creating and maintaining systems that protect children, even from their own parents, when necessary. At a conference in London in 2024, a social worker from India asked Sarah what she thought was the most important lesson from the Blackwood story. Sarah thought for a moment before answering. "I think it's about the power of seeing and being seen," she said. Those boys stood in front of Harrison's camera knowing they were creating evidence of their suffering, even though they couldn't speak about it openly. They stared into that lens with their terror visible, creating a record that would survive long after their voices were silenced. Harrison saw them, really saw them, and even though he didn't intervene in the moment, he preserved what he saw. And now, more than 170 years later, millions of people have seen them, have looked into their eyes and recognized their suffering. That act of witnessing across time, that refusal to look away from difficult truths, that's essential to any kind of justice or social progress. We have to see each other, truly see each other, if we're going to build a world where children are safe and free. The portrait exhibition returned to the Philadelphia Historical Society in 2025 for a special commemorative display marking the 175th anniversary of its creation. The exhibition was expanded to include all the research that had been done over the previous years, all the documents and photographs and letters that told the complete story of the 8 brothers. Descendants of multiple brothers attended the opening, meeting each other for the first time and sharing family stories that confirmed and expanded the narrative Sarah and Marcus had reconstructed. At the opening reception, an elderly woman approached Sarah. She identified herself as a great-great-great-granddaughter of Samuel Blackwood, the youngest brother. She was carrying a small box, which she opened carefully to reveal another smooth stone, similar to the one displayed next to the portrait. "My grandmother told me that Samuel carried 2 stones," the woman explained. "One was from the creek behind the house where they lived in Philadelphia, which he held in the portrait. The other was from a river in Ohio, where he settled after his escape. He said the first stone represented what he had endured, the second represented the freedom he had found. He kept them both until he died, and he told his children to remember that we always carry our past with us, but we get to choose what we build with our future. The second stone was donated to the Historical Society and added to the exhibition. Together, the two stones represented the complete arc of the brothers' story, from suffering to freedom, from victimhood to agency, from silence to testimony. Sarah stood in the exhibition room during the reception, watching people view the portrait, read the documentation, look at the stones, engage with the story. She saw tears, saw people comforting each other, saw parents holding their children closer, saw teachers taking notes for their classes, saw activists inspired for their own work. The portrait of 8 brothers still made people tremble when they looked at it. The terror in those eyes was as immediate and visceral as it had been in 1851. But now viewers also knew the rest of the story, knew that those 8 terrified boys had escaped, had survived, had built lives of meaning and purpose, had transformed their suffering into a force for justice and change. The legacy of Elias Blackwood was not the empire he tried to build, or the dominion he tried to exercise over his sons. His legacy was the opposite of what he intended. 8 men who dedicated their lives to fighting tyranny because they knew its face intimately, who expanded freedom because they had tasted its opposite, who protected others because no one had protected them. The portrait he had commissioned to immortalize his power over his sons had instead become a monument to their resistance. Every time someone looked at those 8 faces and felt moved to protect a child, to stand up against abuse, to question unjust authority, Elias Blackwood's attempt at eternal dominion was defeated again. Sarah had started her research thinking she was studying a curious artifact from the past. She had discovered instead a story that illuminated fundamental truths about power and freedom, about human resilience, about the possibility of transformation. The portrait was not just a window into the past, but a mirror reflecting present realities, a challenge to each viewer to examine their own relationships with power, their own responsibilities to the vulnerable, their own courage to face uncomfortable truths. As the reception concluded and people began to leave, Sarah remained alone with the portrait one final time. She looked at the 8 faces she had come to know so well, at the fear she could never unsee, at the silent plea for help that had echoed across nearly 2 centuries before finally being answered. She thought about Thomas and William and Robert and Edward and Henry and Charles and Frederick and Samuel, about the men they had become, about the lives they had lived in freedom. "You are seen," she whispered to the portrait. "You are heard. Your story is told. You mattered then, and you matter now." The 8 pairs of eyes stared back at her from across the years, and in the precise silver and glass of the daguerreotype, in that captured moment of light from 1851, Sarah could almost imagine she saw not just terror, but also a flicker of something else. Hope, perhaps, or determination, or the stubborn human refusal to be broken no matter how absolute the power arrayed against you. The portrait would remain, would continue to disturb and inspire, would keep telling its story to anyone willing to look closely enough, to anyone brave enough not to turn away. 8 faces frozen in terror had become 8 voices crying out across time, teaching every generation the same essential lesson: that freedom is worth fighting for, that escape is possible, that tyranny can be resisted, that suffering need not be the end of the story. And that, Sarah thought as she turned off the lights and left the exhibition room, was exactly what those 8 boys had wanted all along. Not pity, not sympathy, but to be remembered as they truly were. Survivors who became fighters, victims who became victors, children who grew into men who changed the world. Their faces would continue to make people tremble, but now that trembling would lead not to paralysis, but to action, not to despair, but to hope, not to silence, but to testimony. The portrait of 8 brothers had become what it was always meant to be: evidence of truth, catalyst for change, eternal witness to both the reality of tyranny and the possibility of freedom.